So when you look back at 2018, the start of that massive U.S.-China trade conflict, the standard thinking was all doom and gloom.
Oh, completely. It was all about economic disruption.
Right. Tariffs are flying, costs are going up, supply chains are just freezing. The prevailing wisdom was, pretty simple. Trade wars are lose-lose for everyone involved.
And that narrative dominated the headlines for good reason. I mean, U.S. firms in China, Chinese firms that relied on U.S. markets, they felt immense pressure, measurable pressure.
They had to restructure everything.
Absorb tariffs, pull back on investment. It was chaotic.
But the set of sources we've put together for you today reveals this profound paradox. It flips that entire idea on its head. What if the most powerful consequence wasn't the damage done to the fighters, but the competitive windfall handed to the bystanders?
And that's where we're zooming in on what the research calls third country MNEs.
Multinational enterprises.
Exactly. So think of firms whose home country, maybe Germany, Japan, Switzerland, wasn't directly in the tariff fight. They were the outsiders, just watching the two giants go at it.
And we have a really detailed empirical analysis here. It's built on panel data covering 4 years, from 2016 right through 2019.
It's a huge data set. We're talking about over 3,500 Chinese subsidiary operations from almost 2,000 different outsider MNEs.
And they're from 51 different countries. This is serious systemic data. It's not just a few stories.
Right. And what the researchers wanted to understand is how these outsider firms used a very specific strategic mindset. They call it a real options perspective.
Okay, that sounds a little dense. Can we translate real options?
Of course. Think of it like a stock option. When you buy a stock option, you pay a small fee for the right to buy a stock later, but not the obligation.
So you only pull the trigger if the market moves in your favor.
Exactly. You wait for the perfect moment. So the U.S.-China trade war was like this sudden, massive market shock. For these outsider firms, it unexpectedly lowered the price of investing in China.
So it gave them the perfect moment to exercise a growth option they already held.
That's the logic. They saw a geopolitical crisis not as a risk to avoid, but as a window of opportunity to seize.
So our mission today is to unpack the hard evidence. We're going to look at how they turn that volatility into a real competitive advantage and what specifically they had that made it all possible. Okay, let's jump right to the core finding, because this is really the most shocking part of this whole deep dive. Against all intuition, these third country MNEs, they didn't just sit back and wait. They dramatically scaled up their Chinese operations right in the middle of the trade war. They doubled down.
They absolutely did. And the anecdotal evidence alone is startling. I mean, you look at a German chemical giant like BASF or Volkswagen.
Huge players.
Huge. And they broadened their investments in China, making massive new commitments, new factories, new infrastructure. Or look at Airbus. They announced a second assembly line in the country.
At the same time, American manufacturers were talking about pulling out.
Precisely. These were major capital-intensive decisions made while their American rivals were actively debating how to get their investments out of the market.
That suggests incredible confidence. But was this just a few bold giants, or was this a measurable structural response across the board?
The evidence says it was structural, and to prove it, the researchers use a very precise analytical tool. It was essentially a crucial comparison.
Because you can't just compare all German firms to all U.S. firms. It's not that simple.
Right, you have to be much more granular. The key was to build two extremely specific groups among the third country MNEs. The first group was the treatment group.
Okay.
These were firms operating in sectors, 74 of them, that were highly affected by the U.S.-China tariffs. Think machinery, specific electronics, things where components were heavily taxed.
And the second group?
That was the control group. Firms in about 68 sectors that were largely unaffected by the tariffs. Certain consumer goods, local services, that kind of thing.
So you compare the affected to the unaffected.
Exactly. You see how both groups behaved before the tariffs, and then you track the change after the tariff shock. By comparing the rate of change between those two groups, you can isolate the true impact of the trade war itself.
That's a really smart way to cut through all the noise.
Yeah.
So what did the data tell them? What was the scale of this expansion?
It was a verifiable, massive scale-up, a clear pattern of opportunistic investment, and they measured it using 3 really robust metrics of size and commitment.
Let's talk commitment, because that's what really matters. It's one thing to move money around. It's another to actually hire people and build things.
And they were definitely hiring and building. First, employee counts. Subsidiaries in the tariff-affected sectors saw changes in their employment that were, on average, 10.74% larger.
10.74%.
That's a lot of jobs. It's real job creation fueled directly by the trade war. But it gets even bigger when you look at capital.
Assets on the ground.
Yep. Their total asset valuations, the value of their factories, their machinery, saw a nearly 20% larger change on average, 19.84% to be exact.
Wow. So almost a fifth larger. That's hard proof of long-term capital deployment.
It is. And finally, sales revenues backed it all up, showing a 14.80% larger change on average.
This isn't just temporary. This is a calculated, massive expansion of footprint, staff, and capital. Okay, so we know what happened. The big question is why? Why did a fight between two giants create such a perfect environment for everyone else? What were the actual mechanisms?
Well, there were two main mechanisms, and they're both rooted in how the trade war just fundamentally restructured the competitive landscape.
Okay.
These third-country MNEs could seize those growth options because the crisis created advantages in two key areas. One was efficiency, and the other was market competition.
Let's start with efficiency. How on earth did a trade war make China cheaper for outsiders?
It all comes down to what we call improved factor market conditions. So when the U.S. imposed tariffs, U.S. firms' exports from China dropped immediately.
Right.
And this slowdown in affected sectors created slack in the Chinese factor markets.
So let's say there's a factory in Shenzhen that used to build parts for a company in Chicago. Now it has 25% fewer orders. What does that do locally?
It puts downward pressure on prices for everything. Suddenly, those U.S.-bound firms needed fewer raw materials, fewer component parts, so input costs dropped for everybody else.
And what about labor?
That's the crucial part. It depreciated labor costs. When involved country firms had to cut production, you saw job losses. This created a temporary buyer's market for skilled labor.
So a German firm could hire experienced, skilled Chinese employees with the exact industry expertise they needed for less than they would have paid before the trade war. All because their U.S. rivals were letting people go.
Precisely. The U.S. tariffs were indirectly creating this more affordable pool of specialized talent for their global rivals. And on top of that, the overall drop in capital investment meant less competition for loans and facilities. So suddenly, the entire operational cost environment got significantly cheaper for the outsiders.
That makes the investment option look much more attractive.
A lot more attractive.
Okay, so that's the efficiency side. But even if it's cheaper to operate, you still have to sell your product. What was the advantage they gained in the market itself?
That's the second area. Advantageous strategic competition. This fueled what we call market-seeking FDI, and really it just boils down to tariff disparity.
Okay.
The third country MNEs, let's say a Japanese auto parts supplier, they didn't face new bilateral tariffs with Japan. They could import components or export finished products back home without that new tariff burden.
But the American firms couldn't.
Exactly. U.S. firms were getting hit both ways. They either paid new tariffs on components coming into China for assembly, which raised their internal costs,
Or they faced huge tariffs on products leaving China for the U.S.
which wrecked their global supply chain. This meant U.S. firms operating locally in China instantly became less competitive against the third country firms.
So if you have a German pharma company and an American one competing for Chinese domestic market share, the American firm is now saddled with higher costs on its materials, while the German one isn't.
Which means the U.S. firm's product just got more expensive inside China. The trade war essentially handed market share on a silver platter to the outsiders.
A strategic gift.
It really was. Their rivals' cost structures shot up overnight, and that created a massive competitive advantage that translated directly into gains for the German, Japanese, and other third country firms.
That scale up, nearly 20% growth in assets, that suggests these firms are being incredibly smart. I get the economic logic, but I'm still hung up on the risk.
A political risk.
Yeah. If a trade war is escalating, aren't you exposing yourself to massive uncertainty? What if China decides to retaliate against you next?
That is a critical point. The opportunity was there, but the volatility and the uncertainty were still incredibly high. And this is why the study went on to identify the key strategic resources that allowed these firms to commit despite that risk.
Ah, so they found amplifiers.
Exactly. 3 of them. Characteristics that made this opportunistic expansion even more pronounced. The opportunity was there for everyone, but only certain firms really had the toolkit to take full advantage.
Okay, so what was the first one?
The first amplifier is high MNE multinationality.
Which just means having a very wide global network of operations.
It's more than just being global. It's about strategic flexibility. It's that switching options logic in practice. If factor markets suddenly get cheaper in China, these highly multinational firms, they have the infrastructure ready to pivot quickly and decisively.
How does that actually work on the ground? How does a global network let you scale up faster than a competitor with fewer locations?
It's about the mobility of what they call non-scale-free resources. So if a facility in, say, South America or Europe is underperforming, the MNE can instantly redeploy specialized, expensive assets.
Things like high-tech equipment or capital or key people.
Exactly. Critical equipment, large pools of capital, key executive personnel. They can move them to the newly profitable Chinese subsidiaries and leverage synergies across their entire global empire. A less multinational firm can't do that. They have to wait, raise new capital, buy new equipment. They lose precious time.
So that ability to reroute resources gives them the speed and the confidence to jump on the opportunity.
Absolutely, and the data confirms it. The MNEs with high multinationality saw an amplified scaling effect. We're talking changes in employees, assets, and revenues up to 18.29% higher on average than their low multinationality peers.
Wow. So that network flexibility is a quantifiable weapon in a trade war.
It is.
Okay, so that handles internal flexibility. What about the external risk, the policy uncertainty you mentioned?
That brings us to the second amplifier, local partnerships. Because even outsiders can suffer, collateral damage.
Right.
So having a local Chinese partner, and that's defined here as having shared equity ownership of 5% or more, is instrumental in navigating this high-stakes environment.
They act as a kind of institutional buffer, an interpreter.
Exactly. Local partners provide critical indigenous knowledge. They know the regulatory terrain, the unwritten rules, and most importantly, they provide access to key institutional actors.
Like government officials.
Government officials, regulators. In a time of high policy volatility, that local connection secures a much more stable and favorable operating environment.
It's basically outsourced political risk management.
And it paid off massively. The subsidiaries with local partners saw an amplified scaling up across all measures. They saw changes in assets and revenues that were up to a staggering 26.87% higher on average.
27%. That's a huge difference just based on ownership structure.
When the political ground is shifting, local intelligence is the most valuable resource you can have.
Okay, so what was the final amplifier? It's related to diplomatic backing, right?
Correct. The third factor is bilateral agreements. Specifically things like established free trade agreements or FTAs between the third country and China.
How does an FTA with, say, Switzerland help a Swiss company expand in China during a U.S.-China conflict?
It provides policy certainty. An FTA acts as a formal safeguard. It assures a foreseeable and stable policy environment, even while the U.S. and China are in conflict.
So that stability gives you the confidence you need for those big long-term investments.
The efficiency-seeking and market-seeking FDI we talked about earlier. You're far more willing to commit massive capital if you know your operational framework is protected by a formal treaty, not just shifting political winds.
That makes perfect sense.
And the data backs it up. MNEs operating under a relevant bilateral agreement saw their employee count and asset valuation changes go up by as much as 15.14% higher on average compared to those without an FTA. So if you connect all these dots back to the broader strategic landscape, the research gives us incredibly clear, practical guidance for any multinational firm that's facing this kind of policy volatility.
So what are the actionable takeaways here for a company?
Well, first, MNEs have to be keenly aware of the value of their multinationality. It's not just about reaching more markets. It's about being able to pivot resources globally when a crisis hits, to turn disruption into a gain.
Okay.
Second, they have to actively pursue local partnerships in volatile markets. Use that shared equity to buffer against institutional risk. And third, they should prioritize large-scale investment in countries where favorable bilateral agreements already exist. It positions them perfectly for these kinds of shocks.
And what about for the policymakers, the ones who initiate these protectionist measures?
Well, the implication is pretty stark and I think perhaps unintended.
Oh, so?
The findings suggest that policies like the U.S. tariffs can have this perverse effect. They're designed to pressure a rival country, in this case China, But they can end up hurting your own firms, like U.S. MNEs, by inadvertently empowering and enabling their global rivals, the European and Japanese MNEs in this case.
So by raising costs and uncertainty for U.S. firms, the U.S. government effectively handed a massive competitive advantage to everyone else.
Allowing global competitors to scale up their footprint in the critical Chinese market and just seize market share.
So to wrap up our deep dive today, we saw how third-country MNEs didn't just survive the U.S.-China trade war. They strategically scaled up, exploiting favorable factor markets and the competitive disadvantages their rivals were facing.
And that expansion was supercharged by the flexibility of their multinational networks, the stability from strong local partnerships, and the certainty offered by bilateral agreements. They were perfectly positioned to see the conflict as an opportunity to buy cheap growth options.
But the analysis showed that these outsider MNEs committed substantially more resources, employees, assets, revenues, in the immediate short term. And this raises, I think, an absolutely essential question for what comes next. While these MNEs successfully leveraged the real options of the trade war to expand their physical footprint and capacity,
We still have to determine if this enhanced opportunistic investment actually translates into enduring enhanced performance and profitability, say 5 or 10 years down the line.
or did they just build bigger operations during a temporary market distortion?
That long-term strategic effectiveness, that remains the final frontier of this knowledge.
Something for all of us to mull over until our next deep dive. We'll see you then.